In this first podcast, we're going to look at cells and tissues in the upper gastrointestinal tract and find out how these cells and tissues are normally protected against the corrosive effects of gastric acid. So in general, organs are composed of four different types of tissue, which are epithelial tissue, which separates one compartment of the body from another; connective tissue, which provides a structural role and contains fibroblasts as the main cell type; nervous tissue, which provides sensory and motor signals; and muscle tissue, which have a role in support and movement. So here you see a schematic drawing of a typical epithelium. So it contains the epithelial cells at the boundary of the organ, and so here I drew a single layer of epithelial cells, and typically these epithelial cells are really tightly packed together with very little space between the cells. The epithelial cells are connected to the underlying tissue via this basement membrane, which is a network of proteins such as laminin to which the epithelial cells are attached. Underneath the basement membrane are these long fibers made of, again, of fibrous proteins such as collagen, which are provided by the fibroblasts here in yellow, which are the main cell type that you find in connective tissue. So unlike epithelial cells, which are really closely packed, fibroblasts are usually well spaced away from each other. Other cells that you can find in this interstitial region are immune cells, which enter this region via the circulatory system. And you can also find nerve endings and muscle tissue embedded in this connective tissue here. So in this case, I drew the epithelial cells as a single layer of sort of cuboid cells, but there are many different varieties. Epithelial cells can be organized in different ways. So for instance, you can have simple epithelium, which is characterized by the presence of a single layer of cells, or stratified epithelium, which is characterized by the presence of multiple layers of cells. Epithelial cells can have different shapes. So for instance, they can be cuboid, columnar, or squamous, in which case they are wider than tall. And stratified squamous epithelium can be subdivided again in keratinized epithelium or non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So the keratinized squamous epithelium is, for instance, found on the skin or the lip, and this is the key feature of this type of epithelium is the presence of several layers of dead cells that are mostly composed of networks of keratin, a protein that is cross-linked to each other. And so this these outer layers of dead cells provide some form of some degree of rigidity and mechanical protection against to the underlying tissue. Non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium does not contain these outer layers of dead cells, and this type is, for instance, found in the inside of the mouth or the esophagus. Now, in addition, you can find specialized epithelial cells. So, for instance, in the esophagus, there will be specialized secretory cells, which are called goblet cells, which secrete a fluid that protects the non-keratinized squamous epithelium. And in the inside of the mouth, you will have specialized epithelial cells that form secretory glands that produce saliva and protect the non-keratinized epithelium in the mouth. So knowledge about epithelial organization is not just important for understanding physiology and disease. There is also a pharmaceutical relevance because epithelial cells form an important barrier that can prevent the uptake of drugs and can prevent drugs from reaching their target. So here you see an overview of the epithelium in the stomach. So the epithelium in the stomach is really contains a single layer of cells, so it's simple epithelium. And these cells are covered by a gel-like substance which is called mucus. And this mucus covers these epithelial cells and protects them from the corrosive effects of acid present in the stomach. Now, in the fundus of the stomach, that is the upper part of the stomach, you will also find gastric pits, which are essentially secretory glands where the gastric acid is produced by the parietal cell. Now, if we look more closely at the gastric pit, we can see that there are several different cell types in the stomach. So here at the top you see the mucus cells, or the neck cells, which are located here at the top of the gastric pits, which have very similar characteristics. And these mucus cells, or the neck cells, they produce this mucus, this protective layer that covers most of the inside of the stomach. So this mucus contains a network of glycosylated proteins that are secreted by the mucus cells, and also bicarbonate, which keeps the pH in the mucus layer neutral. So down the gastric pit you'll find different cell types, for instance the parietal cell, which produce gastric acid, and further down other cell types, for instance cells that produce the hormone gastrin, or chief cells that produce pepsin, which is a protease. So if we look more closely at the mucus cell, or the neck cell, which contains many similar characteristics, we can see that there is asymmetry. We call the mucus cell therefore a polarized cell. So towards the inside of the stomach, towards the lumen of the stomach, you can see many vesicles in the mucus cell. So these vesicles the presence of these vesicles are really typical for secreting cells, and they contain the glycosylated proteins, so these proteins containing sugar chains that will form the mucus. Towards the basement membrane, you can find the nucleus. So the part of the membrane that is facing the basement membrane is called the basolateral membrane. And by contrast, the part of the membrane that is facing the inside of the stomach is called the apical membrane. And so the basolateral and the apical membranes are strictly separated by protein membrane structures, which are called tight junctions. And these structures, they prevent movement from the apical membrane to the basolateral membrane and the other way around. And they also prevent the movement of small molecules between the cells. So in that way, they also contribute to the protection of the underlying tissue against the acidic environment of the stomach. Now, tight junctions that we just discussed are not the only type of junctions between cells. So important other types of junctions are the so-called anchoring junctions between cells, which link the cytoskeletons and therefore provide rigidity to a group of cells. And these anchoring junctions are also important for interactions and attachment of cells to the basement membrane. A third type of junctions that are important are gap junctions, so-called gap junctions, and these allow passage of small molecules between cells. What we've discussed so far helps us to understand why normally the gastric tissue is protected from the acid present in the stomach. But what happens when things go wrong? So what happens when the protective lining is damaged? So when mucus is partially degraded, for instance, by a bacterial infection by Helicobacter pylori, or when NSAIDs are used. In those cases, the epithelial cells are directly exposed to the acid in the stomach. And this causes initially cell stress and eventually cell death, which in turn leads to exposure of the underlying tissue to the gastric acid. So cell death is sensed by immune cells, such as mast cells that are located in the interstitial region. And in turn, these mast cells will release histamine, which is a signaling molecule that attracts all different types of immune cells to this area. So these immune cells, they arrive at this site of damage via the capillaries. So this causes increased blood flow and a reddening of the area. Once the immune cells arrive in the damaged area, they facilitate tissue repair, wound repair, and this invasion of and accumulation of immune cells causes swelling that can be noticed. When capillaries are directly damaged, bleeding can occur, and the tissue damage can also lead to pain signals that are sensed and released by nerve endings in this area.